Welcome to another virtual panel discussion from the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. Today's discussion is the first of our mass atrocity prevention and R2P events of the academic year. And this event is organised in partnership with the Cambridge Initiative on Religion and International Studies, also based here in the Centre for Geopolitics. Today we tackle the first in a series of discussions on the role and relation of faith and faith-based actors in implementing the responsibility to protect. Our eminent panel today will be discussing Christian perspectives. The secular language of R2P, it's often argued, facilitates intercultural dialogue on sovereign rights and atrocity prevention. But given the religiously informed worldview of a vast proportion of the world's population, does this secular discourse come at a cost of a deeper embrace of R2P principles? And further, there is often remarked a disconnect between faith actors and R2P proponents, which stems from a mutual misunderstanding. So we'll hope to be able to bridge some of that today. And interestingly, not one in our previous 10 webinars on R2P in this series was religion as a serious concept discussed, which I think was telling. And so in our conversation today on religion and R2P, we'll focus on two interrelated questions. One, the religious and arguably Christian roots of the doctrine. And two, its application in defense of religious communities as religious communities. And I look forward to our discussion of these things and many others over the next hour. And I'm Tom Peake, Research Associate at the Centre for Geopolitics. And I'm joined today by Valerie Morkevičius, Associate Professor of Political Science at Colgate University and author of Realist Ethics, Just War Traditions as Power Politics. Andrew Natsios, Executive Director at the Bush School and Director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs, also at the Bush School at Texas A&M University. He was previously the Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development, US Special Envoy to Sudan, and Vice President of World Vision US. And finally, Msgr Richard Gyhra of the Section for Relations with States of the Secretariat of State of the Holy See. Working in the multilateral sector, he has served in the Apostolic Nunciature in the Dominican Republic and also in the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the UN and other international organizations in Geneva. And welcome to our truly global audience. I encourage you to submit questions to the panel through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just type it in and send it away, and the magic of the internet will bring it to our panelists. And please do note whether your question is directed to a specific panelist or to the panel in general. And also please do leave your name and your university or other affiliation if you have one. Now, before we get to our always fascinating questions from the audience, we'll first invite each of our speakers to say a few words, beginning with Professor Morkevičius.
So good evening, everyone, or night or morning, depending on where you are. I'd like to preface what I'm about to say today by saying that I'm a political scientist. So I'm someone who looks at religiously inspired traditions of just war, but I look at them through a particular political lens. So my starting point is the view that just war traditions, I think, don't aim really to prevent violence, but to channel it in socially appropriate ways. And one of those ways is to think about how to create an international order which provides more justice and more order for more people. But in order to do that, I think the just war traditions are inherently wrought with questions about good governance. And I'd like to think about what those questions of good governance mean a bit for why intervention or responsibility to protect might be possible to do and when and by whom. So the three just war traditions with which I'm most familiar, the Christian, Islamic, and Hindu traditions, share the belief that rulers who overstep the bounds of their authority lose the right to rule their people. Aquinas, for example, firmly denounced tyrants. Grotius argued that a king forfeited his power if he set out with a truly hostile intent to destroy a whole people. Likewise, Vittoria claimed that sovereignty could be violated if a state refused to abstain from oppressive acts, arguing that it is a good ground for making war on them and proceeding against them under the law of war, and for changing their rulers and creating a new sovereignty over them. Within the Christian tradition, this wrong of tyranny is that the tyrant fails to maintain order and justice, which are the two goods that any sovereign is under the responsibility to maintain. Thus, the sovereign's responsibility is to demonstrate neighbor love for the people in their own state as well as in other states. Neighbor love, as understood by Augustine and Aquinas, involves both a responsibility to protect the vulnerable and also a responsibility to restrain, reform, and punish wrongdoers. This duty is understood as extending beyond the borders of the state. As Paul Ramsey, a contemporary theologian, put it, while Christ did teach that disciples should turn the other cheek, he did not counsel them to lift up the face of other oppressed men for them to be struck on their other cheeks. Instead, it's the work of love and mercy to deliver as many as possible of God's children from tyranny. Islam and Hinduism share this belief that a good king, one who deserves to rule, establishes a just order domestically. Within Islam, leaders lose their legitimacy if they oppress the people or fail to enjoin good and restrain evil. From the Hindu perspective, a king who could not keep the peace or who used the kingdom for his own personal pleasure to the detriment of the good of all naturally loses his legitimacy. But this sort of overlap between religious traditions is a thin one. There are differences between the traditions into what constitutes just order. I don't have time to go into them here, but you can imagine what some of those might be. Consequently, while there's a natural overlap between the secular principles of the responsibility to protect and the religious just war traditions, any attempt to specify precisely what sorts of wrongs constitute legitimate reasons to overthrow governments is likely to run into significant opposition from religiously inspired thinkers and communities. We also have to struggle with the question of who has the right to intervene. Does this emerging norm imply that the international community as a whole has the right and responsibility to intervene? Or does it simply permit that to individual states, perhaps whichever state is most able to respond, as James Pattison might argue, or just the Security Council? And can shifting the locus of sovereignty temporarily away from the state's own rulers really be a legitimate political move at all? Shouldn't the right and responsibility to respond to tyranny fall to the people, and only the people, as part of the right to self-determination? I'd argue that thinking through the historical just war traditions and how they understood the rights and responsibilities of sovereignty can help us address these questions. For Aquinas, as for Althusius, Luther, and even Grotius, it's clear that even though tyrants don't deserve to be obeyed, the common people don't have the collective right to overthrow them, although they could act legitimately in individual self-defense. Instead, they argued other states, foreign kings, were permitted to intervene to reestablish domestic justice and order. From the point of view of traditional just war thinking, this two-step suggests that legitimate authority had to remain in the hands of sovereigns, even if it shifted from one sovereign to another. By contrast, as a point of why religious traditions might disagree on exactly who R2P is empowering to act, traditional Islamic just war thought embedded within the juristic tradition implies that rebellion by the people is permissible in response to tyranny. Rather than seeing rebellion itself as the sign of disorder, Islam took rebellion to be the result of it. Indeed, several early Muslim legal scholars upheld a duty to rebel in cases where the caliph failed to uphold his public Islamic duties. Thus, al-Mawardi, al-Ghazali, and others pointed to the Quran to justify rebellion against such tyrants. Instead of forbidding rebellion, Islamic jurists imposed strict rules on how it could be carried out and equally strict rules on how it could be suppressed in cases where the ruler thought that he was incorrectly being targeted for removal. Approaching the problem of rebellion from this perspective can help us refocus on the key issue, finding the most efficacious path to recreating justice and order, which after all is the point, I think, of R2P. Not all forms of rebellion or violence create disorder, and the response to rebellion may itself create more disorder. Thus, some of our assumptions may have to shift. State sovereignty can't be upheld as the paramount value, but should instead be seen as dependent on a state's ability and willingness to provide a just order for its people. But again, in all of this, the devil is in the details. A final question we might ask regarding R2P and the classical traditions is the question of when to intervene. How bad does the situation have to be? For the classical Christian just war tradition, as well as in Islam, the focus on order as a good means that the overthrowing of kings is a very serious business fraught with potential dangers. As Aquinas pointed out, the disorder caused by rebellion could sometimes be greater than the disorder caused by the tyrant, and in such cases, rebellion would be unjustified. The same would presumably be true by extension of humanitarian interventions under R2P. This pragmatic aspect of classical just war thinking, the need to weigh the costs of intervention for good against the harms that will be achieved in those interventions, seems to me to be absent in much of the discussion surrounding R2P today. So in summary, I think that within these religious traditions, there is a thin area of overlap, but not a thick one, which means that when push comes to shove, trying to corner R2P legal scholars on what would be acceptable for the entire global community might be more difficult than it at first appears. Thank you.
Many thanks, Valerie. It's a very interesting opening salvo. Now we turn to Andrew Natsios.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to speak as a practitioner, a development professional who teaches for 12 years now. I have taught both first at Georgetown, now at Texas A&M. The role of the religious community in human rights and in R2P in a broad sense. Just to begin, I spoke in favor of the R2P resolution at the General Assembly of the United Nations as the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is the foreign aid agency of the U.S. government. And I might add, one of our senior career officers, Bill Garbeling, helped draft the actual resolution. He was on the committee, and the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which I ran 30 years ago in AID, was a big advocate of protections for internally displaced people. As you know, in international law, there has long been protections for refugees, but not for IDPs. And the R2P doctrine was meant to deal with that disparity between protecting people who are displaced within their own country in a conflict or a famine versus people who've crossed a national boundary to a neighboring country. And that's what R2P did. I wrote actually a chapter on what happened in Darfur for a book on the responsibility to protect that was edited by Jared Genzer and Irving Coulter. The Oxford University Press published some about 10 years ago, I think it was. On what happened in Darfur. But from a faith-based perspective, I was at World Vision for 5 years as vice president. I do not speak for them. I've been in the World Vision for 25 years. I am an Orthodox Christian, but earlier in my life, I was a Presbyterian and a Congregationalist. So I was out of the Calvinist tradition, actually, my early years. But for 20 years, I've been in the Orthodox Church, and I can speak a little bit for, where those traditions come from. World Vision and other faith-based evangelical NGOs, many of them now are much more ecumenical. So I think 20% of the staff when I was at World Vision were Catholics. They're Catholic bishops sitting on some of the country boards of directors of the World Vision national offices in the developing world. And they raise money among Catholics, not just Protestants. I was intrigued because I was educated at Georgetown as a student 50 years ago and had Jesuits as professors. And I was intrigued that Catholic, not just war teaching, but social justice teaching in general, is very similar, even though they use different language, than the theology that's been developed by World Vision and other evangelical NGOs, of which there are like 40. They have their own teaching on this. It's scripturally based. The evangelicals would say that the only source of truth is the Bible. They would not say church teaching or the hierarchy is, because there is no hierarchy in the evangelical church per se. It's not actually not a formal church. It's a tradition or a movement, you might say. And but if you read they have many books written on this. Fuller Theological Seminary in California works with World Vision on this. It's a more conservative evangelical seminary. A lot of their books are on this subject. There's a lot of similarity to Catholic social teaching, but they use different language, and they don't appeal to the teachings of the church fathers. The Orthodox Church is very heavy into the Apostolic fathers, and then the Philokalia has writings for 1,000 years in one book of church teachings. And so, but the thing, practically speaking, in the field, my own view is that the faith-based NGOs have an advantage the secular NGOs do not have, which is they have a grassroots base of operations in the developing world that secular NGOs develop, but they don't have it as an indigenous part of the society. So a Muslim NGO in a Muslim country can go to the mosque and say, look, we have some authority here, we'd like to work with you. There are Muslim doctors associations in most Muslim countries, and I might add World Vision would work with them, and I might add that USAID works with Muslim doctors associations all over the world on health issues. So Peter Berger, who taught at Boston University for many years, has argued that that the secular West is really an island in a sea of religiosity, of faith traditions. So I would say maybe 3/4 of the population of the world, they vaguely know what the UN is, what the UN Charter is, but if you ask them what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are, they would not be able to tell you. I would say 75% of the population of the world may have heard of it, they know the UN exists, and they have a favorable image of it. But if you ask them to compare the tradition of their faith, whether they're Muslims or Buddhists or Christians or Hindus or Jews or on the other Christian traditions within the larger church, they would probably be much more familiar with the teachings of their church. So when I was the aid administrator and I would go to a country, I always asked to meet with the leaders of all the faith traditions in one room. Sometimes, I did it in Macedonia once, they had never been in the same room together. I asked for the Albanian Muslim, the Imam of the Albanian Muslims, the Archbishop of the Macedonian Orthodox Church, the Methodists, who had their own churches there, and there was a small Jewish community. We all met together. They had never met together before. This was just a week before 9/11, interestingly enough, and the country was on the border of civil war. And I said, could you issue a statement against violence, settling this dispute in Macedonia? And we had a 2-hour meeting. U.S. ambassador was sitting there. He said, Andrew, why are we doing this? I said, because they have more influence than you do, or the UN, or the EU, or anyone else. And if we can get them to tamp this down, maybe we won't have a civil war here. And they actually worked something out over time. There was a lot of nervousness about some of them about how their parishioners would feel. The Imam was particularly nervous about some of the more militant Albanian secular groups that might target him if he signed a statement. But there was no civil war, and I don't know if that meeting had anything to do with it, but it was certainly not damaging, and I think it was helpful for the leaders to start talking, and they continued the discussions long after that meeting was held. I was in Bangladesh with the Muslim community at the Quranic Institute about stopping human trafficking. And 90% of the people in Bangladesh are Muslims. And I asked the imams and the mullahs, could we get your help in stopping this horrible trafficking of children, particularly? And they were not only cooperative, they were militant on this issue. And the USAID worked with that Quranic Institute on this to set up a network to stop human trafficking. We work with Buddhist monks in Cambodia against human trafficking as well, particularly of children. And they were very helpful in this. But they all spoke and thought and worked out of their own religious traditions, not out of R2P. And I'm just say again, I support the R2P doctrine, but if you really want to influence people and their behavior in the developing world, it is far more practical and effective to go through their faith traditions and their religious leaders than it is to appeal to international humanitarian law, which again I support, but is not particularly effective in convincing people. There on all of the sacred doctrines, sacred documents of these traditions, there are verses, there are writings about tolerance, about the sanctity of human life, and about, we wouldn't call it human rights, but if you read what it's saying, it is human rights. So I think that there is a confluence of these religious traditions when they're interpreted correctly, because you always find people who are misusing the scriptures of these traditions to encourage violence, when in fact, I know a lot of Muslim scholars, imams, have criticized bin Laden. He had absolutely no authority to make any fatwas on anything. And I met with many of them, and they were outraged that he would even suggest he had any authority in the matter, because he didn't. So I think there are things that are common in these faith traditions and consistent with the R2P doctrine of the responsibility to protect. But we don't meet with each other. We don't talk with each other that much, and that's, I think, unfortunate.
Thank you very much, and I think really look forward to picking up on a lot of these threads in the follow-on discussion. But before we move on to taking questions on the floor, and I'm sure we'll have many, please, Msgr Richard Gyhra.
Thank you, and good evening to all. Welcome. I'm very pleased to be welcomed into this wonderful and distinguished panel. I'm really happy to have heard the interventions of the two other speakers this evening, because in many ways, you've done the work for me. Valerie kind of built up the whole background there of the just word theory, and looking at it from the different religious backgrounds, but especially from the Christian perspective of Augustine and Thomas. And then Andrew did an excellent job of diving into a point that for the Holy See, for the Catholic Church in general, is very important, namely the role of religious actors, faith-based organizations on the ground to really implement, more or less, without using the term, the responsibility to protect. In my brief comments, I would just like to touch upon a couple of points. One would be kind of the general approach, if you will, of the Holy See to responsibility to protect. Another point would be the role of religious leaders in promoting human rights and promoting peaceful coexistence, which ties in certainly to the responsibility to protect, R2P. And then some of the, a couple of perhaps more difficult or spiny issues that the Holy See is concerned about with regard to responsibility to protect. As far as the general approach, of course, as a new principle, more or less, responsibility to protect doesn't have any explicit references within the last, shall we say, 100 years of the Catholic social teaching. The first time we really see it in any kind of magisterial way is with Pope John Paul II. And of course, his background as a Thomist, his background as one who was formed very much in natural moral law, saw this as a natural fit to the long-standing teaching of the Church with regard to the just war doctrine. Interestingly, that teaching of John Paul II on R2P was, shall we say, codified in the Compendium of Catholic Social Doctrine that was published in 2004. And this is, I think, kind of a watershed moment, because it's showing that at this point, the Catholic Church, the Holy See, is recognizing this as a valid ethical, moral principle, without getting into the details, of course, of how it's applied or of the other juridical issues that come along with it, namely what needs to take place for R2P to be kind of fully actuated or realized within the structure of the UN, and specifically within the UN Charter. But that having been kind of codified, shall we say, within the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching, I think represents a very important point. To build upon that, Pope Benedict XVI, and oftentimes people say, well, we should listen to the preaching of John Paul II because he was such an awesome preacher and such a powerful, shall we say, performer, if you will. He was trained in theater as a young man. And then we should read Pope Benedict XVI, because although he may not have come across as a very dynamic speaker, he's very profound in his writings. And one of the speeches that he gave at the UN, I think, really kind of encapsulates the position of the Church, the Holy See, giving its background and also then its scope or aim in its recognition of the responsibility to protect. I just want to share with you all a quote from Pope Benedict XVI in his speech that he gave to the UN. This is back in 2008. He says, "The recognition of the unity of the human family and attention to the innate dignity of every man and woman today find renewed emphasis in the principle of the responsibility to protect. This has only recently been defined, but it was already present implicitly at the origins of the UN and is now increasingly characteristic of its activity. Every state has the primary duty to protect its own population from grave and sustained violations of human rights, as well as from the consequences of humanitarian crises, whether natural or man-made. If states are unable to guarantee such protection, the international community must intervene with the juridical means provided by the UN Charter and in other international instruments. The action of the international community and its institutions, provided that it respects the principles undergirding the international order, should never be interpreted as unwarranted or as an unwarranted imposition or as a limitation to sovereignty. On the contrary, it is indifference or failure to intervene that can do real damage." And that's the end of a quote I want to share there. So he really gets down to the heart of what I would call even perhaps an evolution in the terminology of national sovereignty. In other words, we speak in terms previously of just war and protecting sovereignty as if it were an absolute in many ways, which is a misunderstanding. And then we started using terminology in the international community of intervention, which of course has implications of military intervention and striking, to now this, shall we say, a softened yet no less powerful terminology in the responsibility to protect. And I think in some ways this is also what the Holy See and what the popes are saying here too, is to emphasize the accountability aspect of sovereignty, that leaders of nations are not able to just get away and do whatever they want. They have indeed this obligation to be accountable for the good of their people. And I think this is coming to now Pope Francis and his emphasis when he speaks on the responsibility to protect is really now getting to more of an application of it, and how can we, first and foremost, prevent conflicts. And I think we've seen this throughout the pontificate of Pope Francis, how he's called upon and engaged himself as well over and over again in all efforts to try to promote peace, in all efforts to try to facilitate interreligious and intercultural dialogue, based on the premise, which I would say is not necessarily Christian, because really it's something that I think applies to all humanity, based on the fact that we all share one human nature, that we're all brothers and sisters, created in God's image and with an inviolable dignity that should not be trampled upon by anybody else. And so no one has the right to trample on the rights of another. And I think starting from that base point, Pope Francis has really made great efforts and put much energy into this area, and seeing this really as the sine qua non for moving forward as far as trying to have peaceful coexistence. And that message is something that I think has resonated quite well with the interreligious community, if I may say so. His document on human fraternity that he signed in Abu Dhabi in February 2019 with the Imam El Tayyib of Egypt had a wonderful resonance globally. And even more recently, his papal encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, Brothers All, which basically kind of has given an overview of his whole kind of international or global politics vision, if you will, and with the strong emphasis on building the bridges of mutual understanding among different religious confessions and groups, so as to build peace. A couple of the things that the Holy See is concerned about on a practical level with the implementation of the responsibility to protect, and these are perennial issues, I think, but the fact that we haven't had yet a concomitant, if you will, sort of reform of the UN Charter that would really allow for a greater ease or a better way of implementing the responsibility to protect, and most especially the question of the veto in the Security Council. So with that, of course, come in questions of political will. Many countries will say, yes, we agree that we should do everything to avoid mass atrocities, genocide, war crimes, and the like. But yet when it comes to actually doing something, they seem to refrain or put the brakes on. And I would say that's probably tied very closely to the fact that when we talk about responsibility to protect and whatever intervention that may imply, it's very important, and this ties back into the question of applying just war theory, is tying back into what are the consequences of said intervention. Could it potentially create more problems than it's attempting to correct? So these are a couple of things. And then also the question, as Andrew pointed out, the real question of confronting the issue of internally displaced persons, stateless persons who are totally abandoned and unprotected. And in many ways, the only help they have are, if they are around, the faith-based organizations that might be operating in that country. And again, I would echo the point of Andrew that on the ground, there's a lot more trust and confidence, ability to, associate with and understand someone who is with a faith-based organization, with a Christian or Muslim or Jewish NGO, rather than someone who's, helicoptered in, so to speak, and, wearing a blue helmet or, wearing a symbol of UNHCR or what have you, and not really knowing, who are these people? Can we trust them? Because they don't have perhaps the language, perhaps they don't have the cultural insight that the faith-based organizations would have. So I'll wrap up there. I think I've probably spoken too much. That way we can get into our discussion.
Thank you very much, Richard. And no, not at all spoken too much. And thank you all for your interventions. And just like to pose a question to Valerie here. And first of all, as a kind of a ground clearing exercise, it's of course widely accepted by now that R2P is about so much more than military intervention. But given that, Pillar 3 does indisputably remain an important and the most controversial aspect of the principle. So given this, how do we think historically and conceptually about the relationship between Christian just war theory and contemporary understandings of R2P?
So I think something that is interesting to think about, and that I didn't have a chance to sort of talk about in my prepared comments, right, is that I think the Christian just war tradition thinks about the question of what comes both before and after any sort of intervention in a very serious way that I think R2P is also trying to do, right? So if the logic within the Christian just war tradition for permitting a military intervention is this idea that you're fighting to restore order, to create or recreate a just peace, then you can't just go in and remove a bad sovereign and walk away, right? Because there's a whole structure of society that needs to be cared for and reconstructed and put back in order. And I think that the Christian just war tradition quite naturally leads one to think about that, both from the point of view of its original conception, thinking about just cause, but it's also a way in which we might get at, in practical terms, what right intention means. Right? So the idea in ad bellum Christian just war thought that you have to demonstrate that you had a right intention, not just a just cause, but that you meant it. That's really what motivated you and not some hidden other agenda. One way I think to demonstrate that is to show a significant concern for reconstruction, for rebuilding. And I also think, a little bit on the scope of your question, but I've been pondering it while Andrew and Msgr were speaking, it occurred to me that this also applies to sort of thinking about the role of just peace thought, which is an emerging tradition in Catholicism and in some denominations of Protestantism that suggests that even before we get to just war, we should be thinking about how we avoid needing to use military force in the first place. And I think that the first pillar of R2P, thinking about prevention, really gets to that as well. So I think in a way, there's a lot that R2P is doing that sounds very much like what the faith-based Christian just war tradition is imagining.
Thank you. And kind of following on from this, directing this question specifically to Andrew, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the specificities of the Orthodox, or what are the specificities of the Orthodox perspective on R2P? So we hear a lot about the Protestant, and we hear a lot about the Catholic approaches.
There was a council of bishops. We do not accept in the Orthodox Church the authority of one person, the Pope, in the Catholic tradition, to speak without error. But we do believe the bishops can speak without error in council. And so there have been many councils. The Council of Nicaea, of course, wrote the Nicene Creed, and there have been many disputes in the Eastern Church since the separation of the East and the Western Church in the 11th century. But we haven't had a council in centuries, and we had one, I think it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, on the island of Crete, and most, but not all, of the autocephalous churches. Autocephalous means that there are independent hierarchies. I think there are 13 autocephalous churches, maybe 14, in the Orthodox Church, and they each have their own patriarch, which they elect. But the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, whose seat is in Istanbul, because that was the tradition of the church there was founded by Saint Andrew in the 1st century, and the Eastern Church has had the ecumenical patriarch, the patriarch of all patriarchs, seated there for 2,000 years now. And he presided, and they came out with a set of documents. All of the traditions signed the documents. They did not, I don't think, specifically endorse the R2P doctrine, but they made statements on issues of justice and human rights, on relationships to other faith traditions. They dealt with some of the issues that Vatican II dealt with in the Catholic Church in the 1960s. They didn't say it in the same way, they didn't reach necessarily the same conclusion, but they tried to deal with some of the more modern issues that Orthodox Church faces. And every church signed it, but then 2 churches, without going to specifics, did not attend, and it sort of undermined the council, I think, political intention. I think there were secular forces at work to undermine this, and I don't want to get into the details of it, but it was very troubling to a lot of us. Most Orthodox countries now are functioning democracies that protect human rights, but there are a couple that are not. And I think there are other agendas at work here. I know the patriarch, the ecumenical patriarch, has spoke out on in Orthodox countries on civil conflict where religion was involved, and he has made very clear that there is no justification in Orthodox tradition for the use of violence and intolerance in these wars in Orthodox countries. And he also has been very big on the environment, and so There are a lot of his encyclicals that are, they don't have the same authority. He cannot speak with the same authority that the Vatican can with the Pope because of our traditions that only the bishops can do that. But he still has authority, and his encyclicals are still read, his letters. In many Orthodox countries, the church will be involved in efforts at reconciliation. I know, for example, in Ethiopia, when HIV/AIDS was raging across the country, I went and visited the patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and then I went to see the Council of Imams of the Muslims, because there are a large number of Muslims in Ethiopia as well. Well, the interesting thing was the AID mission there had actually arranged for the patriarch of the Orthodox Church to go all over the country and tell them there was a terrible disease being spread, and it was, you know, there were sexual implications to it, and that they needed to be more careful about what their children were doing, their teenage children. And he preached. And I said, well, that was good for the Orthodox. He said, oh, the Muslims used to come too, because the patriarch is revered in the Muslim community in Ethiopia. And Muslims would come equally with the Christians. It's a Sufist tradition of Islam, not the more not bin Laden's tradition. And in the villages, the Muslims help the Christians, the Orthodox Christians, build their churches, and the Orthodox Christians help the Muslims build their mosques. And they've had this relationship for centuries. And when there was an effort to import some extremists into the country from Saudi Arabia, the Ethiopian government, with the support of both faith traditions, threw them out of the country and said, we don't need religious wars in this country. We don't want it. We got along fine with the other traditions, and we're not going to tolerate this. They were asked to leave. Saudis didn't like it very much, but that's what happened. So you can go through different instances of the Orthodox Church intervening in very constructive ways, I think, for reconciliation and for tolerance.
Thank you. And that was a very fascinating insight. And moving on to the Msgr, can we ask how relevant R2P is internally to forming the human rights priorities of the Holy See?
Sure. Well, I think the issue with the use of responsibility to protect is always based upon the enjoyment of human rights. I mean, basically, you're dealing with a situation in which a state, either because it's incapable or unwilling to do so, cannot address major crimes that are taking place, which almost in every occasion is dealing in some way with grave violations, gross violations of fundamental human rights. Whether it's first and foremost the right to life, right to safety, and also the other very closely connected fundamental human rights, rights to religious liberty, etc., to express one's faith without coercion. So the connection there, and the importance that the Holy See sees with this principle of responsibility to protect is as equally as important, I would say, as the emphasis that we give to promoting and defending fundamental human rights. And this, again, you know, it sounds perhaps somewhat repetitive and perhaps simplistic, yet there's a profundity to this teaching of the Catholic Church, and one that Pope Francis has been pushing very strongly, is to recognize that every human being has equal human dignity. No matter your race, religion, ethnicity, background, nationality, that we all enjoy the same equal and inviolable dignity. And if we were to understand that from the most important, powerful leader of the world, or a particular state, to the most vulnerable, weakest individual in our society, then we would have, I think, a much better world that we would be living in, rather than to try to squelch a person's voice because they don't come from our ethnic background, or because they don't share our same religious beliefs. I know that sounds perhaps a little utopian, but in fact, I think that's precisely the message that the church has been pushing constantly, but most especially under Pope Francis and his activity diplomatically on the bilateral and the multilateral levels. So fundamental human rights, especially the promotion of religious freedom, which unfortunately tends to be at the heart of many of our conflicts these days, or at least to have a certain role to play in those conflicts. Were we to overcome those things, I think we would be in a much better position. And I think that the Holy Father, Pope Francis, is very much convinced of that approach as well. Hence his appeal not only to secular leaders but also to religious leaders, to try to bring that message down to the believers, the followers of the various religions, to kind of see this insight, to recognize it as a fundamental truth of our common humanity, and then to implement it, to practice peace, so to speak, be artisans of peace, as Pope Francis commonly says. So yeah, the role of human rights is absolutely intertwined, and the respect of human rights is absolutely intertwined with the question of responsibility to protect. Yeah.
Thank you. And now taking our first question from the audience. This is from Peter Walsh, and this is directed to all of the panelists, but perhaps Valerie might like to take the first go. So the Russian veto at the UN Security Council has effectively ended any attempts at R2P in regard to Syria for now over 8 years. The NGO and faith communities have been largely silent on this. Should there not be more willingness by these non-state actors, and I suppose we're talking specifically here about faith-based actors, to speak truth to power if R2P is to have any impact in the real world?
I think that's true, right? So one of my mentors in learning about the just war tradition is James Turner Johnson, and his argument is that the just war tradition has always been about that, about trying to speak truth to power. And I think that there are maybe not enough non-state actors speaking up, but also sometimes when we do speak up, those of us who are not necessarily involved with NGOs or with international politics, but who write and think about just war, within the just war community, there's been a tendency to move in one of two directions. So some of my fellow travelers who study just war theory are moving in directions that really approach pacifism, which means they're not very likely to challenge vetoes at the UN Security Council because they're fundamentally suspicious that power and force can ever be used to accomplish any good, right? So that is one problem that would need to be overcome. The second problem is that even those who do, in a sense, speak truth to power have sometimes in the last 20 years made mistakes about what they thought was really going on. They believed, academics, including Jean Elston and others, believed arguments that they were receiving from their governments. So I think that amongst academic just war thinkers, we're now a little bit unsure of what speaking truth to power looks like, right? So I think, yes, we should speak truth to power, and so should faith-based NGOs. But I also think we have to be cautious because there's some danger also in, we can't cause, I think, states to not use their vetoes. But there's a good reason why the veto system exists, which is to get the buy-in of great powers. And if the great powers are more likely to go to war with each other, we might end up with less order in the world in our attempt to pursue more order. So that was probably a bit rambling by way of an answer, but I hope it was useful.
Let me just add one, if I could, with respect to Syria. One of the archbishops and one of the bishops of the Syrian Orthodox Church were kidnapped at the beginning of the war. We don't know whether they're alive or not. We believe they're being held hostage. Some of us believe that. We pray for them every week, but this has been six years now. And we don't even know who. We don't know whether it's the government of Syria that did it or the rebels that did it. All we know is we have not heard from them. And many people think it was designed to intimidate the Orthodox Church into silence on these issues because we don't want one of the senior clerics of the church to be assassinated or murdered by them. Or this young bishop who was also kidnapped. So the government of Syria, oddly enough, has been the most tolerant of Christians in Syria prior to the civil war, mainly because they themselves are a minority. And they're only about 12% of the country, their ethnic group, which is the Alawites, are a small percentage of the population. The Christians are also about 12%. And so they've been tolerant because the Christians are in the same situation. They're very vulnerable. A disproportionate number of the atrocities that have been committed on a scale that's really difficult to even comprehend have been of Orthodox Christians in Syria. It's not all even across all sides. It's the Orthodox they're targeting. They've basically destroyed the Orthodox Church in Syria. If you go to the camps, you'll see a disproportionate number of Orthodox Christians in those camps. And the Islamic fundamentalists were doing it, and some of the other traditions were as well. So it's very tragic. It's horrible. I mean, the patriarch of my church, the Antiochian Orthodox Church, is in Damascus. So we get the reports of what's been going on, the murdered priests and their wives and their children in the villages by some of the rebel groups. So it's easy for us to say they should be speaking out, but when you speak out, if you start having your clerics murdered, then that's a different matter.
Gyhra, what are your thoughts?
Let me just add one story. During the Second World War, during the Nazi occupation of Greece, the commandant, the German commandant, demanded a list of all the Jews on one of the islands. And the bishop, the Greek Orthodox bishop, gave him a list that had one name on it. It was his own name. The commandant threatened to execute him, and he said, "We will not give you any names of any Jews. I will give you my name. If you want to execute me, go ahead." The patriarch sent the head of the Greek, not patriarch, the metropolitan, was the head of the Orthodox Church in Greece, who was a very powerful figure and was a revered figure. He sent a letter out to be read in every Orthodox church in Greece that if you turn over any Jews to the Nazis, that I will condemn you. I even think he threatened to excommunicate people. And it was read in every church, and the commandant called the generals in charge, called in the patriarch and threatened to hang him or to shoot him. And he said, well, traditionally our Orthodox clerics are hung, not shot. Please respect our traditions. But he knew he would have a civil war on his hand if he tried to execute the metropolitan, so he didn't do it. But the church did lead an effort to protect the Jews in Greece during the war. So the Orthodox Church does get involved in these issues in the middle of conflicts like the occupation.
If I may add just a couple of points on that, I think one of the big things, and both Valerie and Andrew touched on this, is really the transparency or the genuineness of the information that we have in these conflict situations. You know, in the case of Syria, of course, there's the possibility, and most likely was, a lot of manipulation of information, trying to sway public attention to one way or another without really knowing what is happening on the ground. There were reports from the bishops in Syria, Catholic bishops there, that were quite different from what we were hearing, for example, from the press, whether in the US or in Europe or in Russia, quite contrasting. So I think that's a very important thing as well, because, getting back to, what are we doing when we're trying to protect? Is it really trying to protect, or is it just simply a tool that's being manipulated or exploited for one power to get back at another? Is it basically a fancy way to fight a proxy war? That being said, I think responsibility to protect, as fantastic as it is, and the Holy See is convinced that it is good, but it's only as good as the level of consensus you have of the major powers involved. Otherwise, I think at risk being less than as effective as it could be.
Absolutely. We come to another question now, which is also directed to you, Msgr. And unfortunately, we only have a couple of minutes left, so we might need to keep our answers relatively swift on this. It's from Robert Straswich, and it's given that the whole concept of the nation state appears increasingly dated, not least because it is being undermined in quotes by R2P, and that the Roman Catholic Church has always maintained a transnational universal outlook. Why does the Holy See tie its own position on R2P back to the nation state? And I suppose the question is, does it?
Well, yeah, I think it does, and I mean I think that's the geopolitical situation that we're in, the era that we're in. We're no longer in the era of kingdoms, but of the nation state, and you know, the principle of national sovereignty is it's a true principle, it's a right principle, but it needs to be understood correctly as well as not something that is absolute. And I think that you know, the tie of the nation state and respect for sovereignty is not contradictory either to a healthy globalism, especially the fact that in our modern day, with everything being interconnected, whether it's trade, commerce, travel, you know, military, you know, cooperation, all of these things. The world that we live in requires also that the individual states in some ways are required to concede some of that sovereignty in order to cooperate with you know, whether it's, you know, a regional group or a continental group for the sake of the common good. And I think that's the point of the Holy See, is that, you know, the national sovereignty certainly does serve a purpose. A nation has an identity, people have an identity, but that should not be considered as an absolute to the detriment of the common good, the greater good for you know, the region or for the globe. So things are evolving, I would say, and we see that in the social teaching, because even though the principles fundamentally remain the same, the application of them has to be to the practical exigencies of the period in which we live and the questions that come to us. So I hope that's somewhat helpful.
I think that's been very, very helpful. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get to any of the many other really fascinating questions we had, and thank you very much to our audience for submitting them. Unfortunately, it's now time to bring to a close this panel on faith in R2P, Christian Perspectives, co-sponsored by the Cambridge Initiative on Religion International Studies. And I would like to thank all of our audience for your participation. And I thank again our panelists, Valerie Morkevičius, Andrew Natsios, and Msgr Richard Gyhra. Please do check back shortly on the Centre's website at www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk, where the video of this discussion will be made available to view and to download. And next Wednesday, at the same time at 6 p.m, Matthew Rowley will be joining the Centre for Geopolitics for a discussion on his new book, Trump and the Protestant Reaction to Make America Great Again. So please do join us for that. And then also, on Wednesday, in 2 weeks' time, on the 28th of October, again at 6 p.m, we will be discussing Jennifer Trahan's exciting new book, Existing Legal Limits to the Security Council Veto During Mass Atrocities. We'll be discussing this with Professor Trahan herself from New York University, Mark Weller, Chair of International Law and International Constitutional Studies here at the University of Cambridge, Federica D'Alessandra, Executive Director of the Oxford Programme on International Peace and Security at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford, and Jennifer Welsh, member of the Centre for Geopolitics International Advisory Board, Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security, and Director of the Centre for International Peace and Security Studies at McGill University in Canada. And that event will be co-sponsored by the Oxford Programme on International Peace and Security at the Blavatnik School of Government. And the registrations for both of those events will be opening very soon. If you're on our mailing list, you will receive an invitation to sign up, and I very much invite you to do so. So once again, allow me to thank our wonderful panelists and our brilliant audience. And unfortunately, on virtual events, there's no round of applause, but I hope we can all kind of imagine it. And until next time, thank you very much.